4 days. That is what stands between the Canadian economy and a 50% tariff wall aimed squarely at some of its most important industries. Not a threat this time, not a letter posted on a social media account, a signed, sealed, legally triggered countdown that began on July the 20th and ends at 1 minute past midnight, Eastern Time, on August the 19th. And buried inside the fine print of that countdown is a detail so specific, so unusual, that trade lawyers across North America have spent the past 3 weeks flagging it in bold, underlined text at the top of client memos. We will get to that detail. But first, you need to understand exactly what is happening, why it is happening now, and why the number 50% on its own does not tell you the real story. Let's start with a headline everyone has heard. On July the 20th, 2026, President Donald Trump signed 3 separate proclamations imposing an additional 50% tariff on a range of Canadian goods. The White House framed it in a fact sheet released the same day as a response to what it called Canada's discriminatory treatment of American autos, alcohol, and dairy products. According to that fact sheet, President Trump was, in the administration's words, offsetting the burden on American commerce and leveling the playing field for American exporters. That is the official line. Whether it survives contact with the numbers is something we will examine closely. To understand why this moment matters, you have to go back further than July. The Canada-United States trade relationship has been under strain for well over a year now. The dispute traces back to February of 2025, when President Trump first announced sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods, a 25% tariff on most imports, and a 10% tariff specifically on Canadian energy products. Canada did not sit still. Ottawa responded with retaliatory tariffs on $30 billion worth of American goods, and when tensions escalated further, that retaliation grew to cover $155 billion in American products within about 3 weeks. That first wave of escalation disrupted decades of tightly woven cross-border trade, from auto parts crossing the border multiple times during assembly to grocery store shelves in both countries. Then came the summer of 2025. In July of that year, President Trump sent a letter, one of more than 20 he dispatched to trading partners that week, warning Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney that a 35% tariff would take effect on Canadian goods starting August the 1st. The BBC reported at the time that this was separate from sector-specific tariffs already in place, including a global 50% tariff on steel and aluminum and a 25% tariff on cars and trucks not built in the United States. Canada, notably, sells about 3/4 of its total goods exports to the United States, which is precisely what makes it so exposed to swings in American trade policy. An auto manufacturing hub, a major metal supplier, a next-door neighbor whose economy is stitched into America's supply chains in ways most consumers never see until prices move. Between that July 2025 letter and the July 2026 proclamations, the relationship went through several more turns worth noting, because they explain the mood both governments brought into this latest round. Global News archival coverage shows Carney vowing as early as March of 2025 that Canada would counter U.S. auto tariffs. By October of 2025, Canada had actually cut some of its counter tariffs against both the United States and China, a gesture toward de-escalation. By August of that year, Carney announced Canada was removing retaliatory tariffs, specifically on American goods that complied with CUSMA, a decision that, looking back now, makes the current situation almost ironic, since the whole point of that earlier goodwill gesture was to reward USMCA compliance, and the new 50% tariffs erase that distinction entirely. Trump, for his part, warned in December of 2025 that he could put what he called very severe tariffs on Canadian fertilizer, a threat that never fully materialized in that form but signaled the pressure was building well before July's proclamations. Through the first half of 2026, American manufacturing data became part of the administration's public case for a tougher trade posture. The White House fact sheet notes that U.S. manufacturing grew at its fastest rate in 4 years in May of 2026, nearly tripling expectations, and expanded for a 6th consecutive month in June. That backdrop of a strengthening domestic manufacturing base appears to have given the administration confidence to escalate rather than pull back. So, when the 50% tariff proclamation landed on July the 20th, 2026, it was not coming out of nowhere. It was the latest and by far the most legally unusual chapter in an 18-month trade war. And here is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because the legal mechanism President Trump used this time was not the one he had relied on before. For most of 2025, the administration's tariff authority rested on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, commonly known as IEPA. But earlier this year, the Supreme Court struck down the broadest of those IEPA-based tariffs. CNN Business reported that many governments and businesses around the world genuinely believed, in the aftermath of that ruling, that the risk of sweeping new tariffs had eased. It hadn't. Trump found another lever, He reached for Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a nearly century-old provision that had, according to trade lawyers John Verno and Catherine Gibson, writing years earlier for the law firm Covington and Burling, gone unused for decades. CNBC reported that this obscure authority allows a president to impose tariffs of up to 50% on the goods of a country the administration determines is discriminating against American commerce. Law firm White and Case confirmed this was the first time any American president had ever invoked Section 338 to impose tariffs. Not modified, not threatened. Actually imposed for the first time in the modern era on July the 20th, 2026. Here's the mechanism in plain terms. Each of the three proclamations targets a different basket of Canadian goods: motor vehicles, alcoholic beverages, dairy products. But the coverage extends well beyond those headline categories. According to the White House fact sheet, the tariffs apply to a list of goods ranging from wine to hockey sticks to cement. Law firm Steptoe noted that the motor vehicle proclamation in particular is broader than its name suggests, also sweeping in lumber and furniture products, certain electrical components, and various agricultural goods. Trade advisory firm Wiley put a number on the total scope: approximately $20 billion in annual Canadian imports affected. White and Case, cross-referencing U.S. import data, calculated that this represents roughly 5% of the total value of all goods the United States imports from Canada. Read that again, because it matters. 5%. Not a blanket 50% tariff wall across the entire Canadian economy. A targeted strike on specific sectors, worth about $20 billion a year, layered on top of an already tense trading relationship. That is an important corrective to the headline, and we will come back to why the administration chose to target these particular sectors rather than go broader. Why these three sectors specifically? The White House fact sheet lays out the administration's case in granular detail. On autos, the fact sheet states that Canada imposes tariffs and quotas on American-made cars that it does not apply to vehicles from other countries, and that Canada administers those quotas in a way designed to push American automakers to build in Canada rather than the United States. The numbers cited are specific. From April 2025 through March 2026, Canadian imports of American motor vehicles fell by approximately 22%, or $5.6 billion, compared with the same period the year before. On alcohol, the fact sheet points to an even steeper decline. American alcoholic beverage imports into Canada dropping by about 81%, or $582 million, over roughly the same window. Reuters and other outlets have reported that this collapse traces back to a decision by nearly every Canadian province to pull American liquor from store shelves in the wake of the earlier tariff rounds. On dairy, Washington's complaint is more structural. Canada's tariff rate quota system on cheese gives European exporters more favorable access than American producers get, despite Canada holding trade agreements with both the United States and the European Union. Canada, for its part, rejects this framing entirely. Ottawa has consistently characterized its earlier countermeasures as a direct response to American tariffs that came first, not as unprovoked discrimination. CBC News quoted Carney describing the July 20th action as, in his words, the latest in a series of unilateral U.S. trade actions in direct violation of the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, a direct rebuttal to the White House's discrimination framing. NewsWeb reported that Carney spoke with President Trump the day after the proclamations were signed, with both sides agreeing to intensify negotiations rather than let their relationship deteriorate further in public. That disagreement, over who started it and who is retaliating against whom, sits at the emotional core of this entire dispute, even as the legal and economic mechanics grind forward on their own separate track. It's also worth understanding just how deep the retaliatory measures Washington is objecting to actually go, because the alcohol figures in particular are not a minor data point. According to reporting cited by multiple outlets, all but 2 of Canada's provinces and territories halted the purchase, distribution, or retailing of American alcoholic beverages entirely in the wake of earlier tariff rounds. Not a tariff on American liquor, but a wholesale removal from shelves, enforced through provincial liquor board policy rather than a border tax. That is a meaningfully different kind of measure than a simple retaliatory tariff, and it's part of why Washington has singled out alcohol as one of the 3 headline sectors in the new proclamations, alongside autos and dairy. Now, what is excluded from these new tariffs is almost as important as what is included, because it shapes how much economic pain actually lands and where. The White House fact sheet and multiple trade law firms, including GHY International and White and Case, confirm the carve-outs. Energy products are excluded. Potash, a critical fertilizer ingredient the United States sources heavily from Canada, is excluded. Fish and critical minerals are excluded. Goods already covered under existing Section 232 national security tariffs, like steel, aluminum, and certain automotive components, are also excluded to avoid double stacking duties on the same product. Certain civil aircraft and aircraft parts, aside from unmanned aircraft, are excluded as well. Trade advisory firm Holland and Knight, in a client note, called this a 50% opening bid, language suggesting this is a starting position in a negotiation, not necessarily a final fixed outcome. There's a structural reason those specific carve-outs exist, and it tells you something about how this proclamation was built. Energy and potash are two of Canada's largest and most strategically important exports to the United States. Pulling either into a 50% tariff would almost certainly have driven up prices at American gas pumps and on American farms within weeks, the kind of direct, visible consumer pain that tends to generate immediate political backlash. By carving them out, along with critical minerals the U.S. relies on for defense and technology manufacturing, the administration built a tariff package designed to pressure specific Canadian industries, autos, alcohol, dairy, and a handful of manufactured goods, while insulating American households from the sectors most likely to show up instantly on a receipt or a utility bill. Whether that calculation holds through the autumn, if the tariffs do take effect and ripple through auto supply chains that cross the border multiple times during a single vehicle's assembly, is a separate question entirely. So, the headline says 50% tariffs hitting Canada. The reality, once you dig into the proclamations, is a narrower sector-specific strike worth about $20 billion, with meaningful carve-outs for energy and critical minerals, the two areas that would have caused the most immediate pain for American consumers and industry if they had been included. That alone reshapes how you should read this story. But it is not the detail that changes everything. That detail is still coming. Here it is. Buried inside every single trade law firm's advisory note on these proclamations is the same warning, repeated almost word for word. Unlike nearly every other tariff action Washington has taken against Canada over the past year and a half, these new Section 338 tariffs apply even to goods that fully qualify under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the USMCA, also known in Canada as CUSMA. Wiley's Trade Alert states this explicitly. Law firm Butzel Long confirms it. Trade compliance firm GHY International puts it bluntly in its advisory. USMCA does not provide relief. A trade research firm called Cara Globe, in an analysis published just days ago, described this as, quote, the detail catching importers off guard. A valid USMCA certificate of origin does not exempt a covered good from the 50% duty. If your product appears in one of the three annexes attached to these proclamations, your USMCA paperwork simply does not matter anymore. To understand why that is such a big deal, you need to know what USMCA has meant for the past several years. The 2020 Trade Pact, the successor to the old NAFTA agreement, was built specifically to let goods move duty-free across the US, Mexico, and Canada border, provided they met rules of origin requirements. It has been the shield that has protected the vast majority of cross-border trade, even as earlier tariff rounds hit non-compliant goods. White and Case notes that more than 90% of goods coming from Canada were previously USMCA compliant and moved tariff-free under that framework. For 18 months of escalating trade tension, USMCA compliance was the thing that kept a huge slice of Canadian exports insulated from the worst of it. Section 338 tears through that shield. Steptoe's trade blog states it directly. Unlike the prior IEPA and Section 122 tariff actions, these new duties apply even on USMCA-compliant products. It is, according to multiple trade advisories, the first tariff action of this scale in the current trade war that simply ignores USMCA status altogether. A business could have done everything right, sourced correctly, documented meticulously, held a fully valid certificate of origin, and still wake up on August the 19th facing a 50% duty on a shipment it had every reason to believe was protected. That is the detail changing everything, not the headline percentage, not even the $20 billion scope. It is the quiet removal of the one legal shield companies on both sides of the border had been relying on to plan around this entire trade war. One trade research firm, Cara Globe, went further in its recent analysis, pointing out that the broadest of the three annexes reaches deep into the machinery and electrical equipment sections of the U.S. tariff schedule, the chapters covering servers, networking hardware and other information technology, and data center equipment. That detail matters because it means the practical reach of these proclamations extends well past the cars, wine, and cheese framing that dominated the initial headlines. A Canadian-based electronics or component supplier with a fully valid USMCA certificate sitting in its export paperwork could find itself facing the same 50% duty as a shipment of Ontario wine, simply because its product code falls inside one of the three annexes. Trade compliance advisories have been urging companies for weeks now to stop assuming that a USMCA stamp is any kind of protection at all under this specific action, and instead to check their harmonized tariff schedule codes directly against the annex text. There's a timing wrinkle too, and it matters if you're trying to understand who gets hit and who does not. Trade firm Butzelong notes that goods loaded onto a vessel before July the 24th, 2026, and entered for consumption in the United States before July the 28th, are exempt from the additional duties, a narrow grace window for shipments already in transit when the proclamations were signed. Beyond that window, though, the clock is simply running toward August the 19th at 12:01 in the morning, Eastern Time. So what happens now, in these final days before the deadline? This is where the story becomes genuinely live, because the events shaping the outcome are unfolding this week, not months ago. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has kept his public posture carefully measured. Speaking to reporters after meeting with Canada's 13 provincial and territorial premiers in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, in late July, Carney said, according to Reuters, that everything's on the table if the tariffs take effect. But he was equally clear that Ottawa would not retaliate before the deadline itself, calling premature action counterproductive while negotiations continue. CBC News reported Carney describing the government's posture as having worked through its options without yet revealing which industries or products any Canadian countermeasures might target. That caution has not stopped provincial leaders from speaking more bluntly. Quebec Premier Christine Frechette warned in Montreal that some industries could find themselves in what she called survival mode if the 50% tariffs proceed as scheduled. Ontario Premier Doug Ford struck a slightly different tone, saying he would be open to allowing American liquor back onto Ontario store shelves, reversing one of the retaliatory measures Washington specifically wants lifted, but only as part of what he called a fair deal that protects Canadian steel, aluminum, auto, forestry, agricultural, and manufacturing sectors. Alberta's government has floated its own pressure point in the other direction, a warning reported through provincial channels that Canada could constrain flows through Line 5, the pipeline carrying roughly 540,000 barrels a day into Ontario and Quebec, illustrating just how many levers both sides have at their disposal if this escalates further rather than resolves. And as of this week, the diplomatic machinery is moving fast. According to CBC News and BNN Bloomberg reporting from August the 13th and 14th, Canada's Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc and Chief Trade Negotiator Janice Charette have been in Washington meeting directly with United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer. Greer described the talks as constructive while speaking to reporters in Des Moines, Iowa, on Friday, but he was explicit about what Washington wants in return: Canada lifting its retaliatory measures, particularly the provincial bans on American alcohol and expanded access to Canada's dairy market. Greer went further, telling reporters that these new tariffs are, in his words, a response to Canadian retaliatory measures, the kind of thing, he said, China would do. That is a notably sharp comparison for a Trump administration official to draw about America's closest northern neighbor. CBC News reported that Greer indicated both President Trump and Prime Minister Carney would soon be presented with what he called options following Thursday's round of talks. Language suggesting a decision point is approaching at the highest level, even if the exact shape of any deal remains unannounced. LeBlanc was scheduled to brief provincial and territorial trade ministers, along with members of the Prime Minister's Advisory Committee on Canada-U.S. relations, on Friday, updating them on where negotiations stand with less than a week remaining before the tariffs take effect. CBC News also noted that Louise Blais, Quebec's envoy for the review of the Continental Trade Pact, confirmed during a Radio Canada interview that both LeBlanc and Chief Negotiator Janice Charette would be delivering that update directly, underscoring just how closely provincial governments are being looped into a negotiation that, on paper, is being conducted at the federal level. It's worth pausing on Greer's specific framing for a moment, because word choice from a sitting U.S. trade representative is rarely accidental. By comparing Canada's retaliatory posture to what he called the kind of thing China would do, Greer was drawing a deliberate contrast, placing America's closest security ally and largest two-way trading partner in the same rhetorical category as the country most associated, in Washington's trade policy circles, with sustained economic confrontation. That comparison landed publicly at the same event where Greer also described the talks themselves as constructive, a juxtaposition that captures just how strange this particular moment in Canada-U.S. relations has become. Two governments that remain deeply integrated economically and militarily, trading pointed public rhetoric even as their negotiators sit across the table from each other in Washington. Not everyone believes this ends cleanly. Colin Robertson, a former Canadian diplomat now with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, told BNN Bloomberg this week that he is uncertain how the standoff resolves, adding, quote, "It looks like it's going to end in tears." Robertson pointed to a detail that has received less attention than the Canada-facing drama. More than 20 American states have themselves taken the Trump administration to court over its tariff policies, a sign that resistance to the broader approach is not limited to the country on the receiving end of the duties. That litigation tracker runs on its own timeline, separate from whatever happens in Ottawa or Washington this week. and several trade law firms, including Holland and Knight, have flagged the possibility of legal challenges specifically targeting the Section 338 action in the Court of International Trade, given that this authority has never before been tested at this scale. There's also an underlying negotiation about Canada's auto tariff rate that is running in parallel and could shape how this entire episode resolves. Canadian vehicles currently face a 25% tariff under a separate action, and according to freight industry reporting this week, Ottawa is pushing to secure the same 15% rate that Japan and South Korea have already negotiated, along with relief from Section 232 steel and aluminum duties. Carney has said publicly that Canada will not accept what he considers a bad deal, while Washington continues to push for the retaliatory measures to come down first. Whichever way those two positions move in the next few days will likely determine whether August the 19th arrives with the 50% tariffs firmly in place, suspended pending a deal, or narrowed through last-minute negotiation. It's worth stepping back and asking why any of this matters beyond the specific dollar figures. Trade lawyers keep returning to one point in their advisories. This is the first real-world test of Section 338 in the modern era, and depending on how it survives legal and political scrutiny, it could become a template the administration reaches for again, against Canada or against other trading partners, precisely because it does not carry the same legal vulnerabilities that got the earlier IEEPA tariffs struck down by the Supreme Court. CNN Business framed the Canada tariffs explicitly as a signal to every other American trading partner. If this authority holds up, you could be next. That is part of why this specific fight over dairy quotas and liquor shelves and auto import numbers is being watched so closely well beyond Ottawa and Washington. There is also a statutory wrinkle inside Section 338 itself that has drawn less public attention than it probably deserves. Beyond the 50% cap on the initial tariff, the underlying law includes an escalation clause. Section 338, Part B, according to Holland and Knight's analysis, actually authorizes the president to move beyond tariffs entirely and impose a full import ban if a targeted country is found to maintain or increase what the statute defines as discrimination against American commerce. Nobody in the current dispute is publicly discussing an outright ban on Canadian goods, and Holland and Knight's own note frames this as a background risk to monitor rather than an imminent step. But its mere presence in the statute is part of why trade lawyers are treating the current $20 billion action less as an isolated event and more as a marker in an escalation ladder that, at least on paper, still has room to climb if the current round of negotiations collapses entirely. The Court of International Trade angle deserves a bit more detail as well, because it runs on an entirely separate track from the diplomatic negotiations happening this week. Section 301 tariffs imposed on roughly 60 other trading partners around the same period, covering separate forced labor-related concerns, have already drawn lawsuits, including a putative class action filed in the Court of International Trade the same day those measures took effect. Law firm Butzel Long reports that plaintiffs in those cases argue the tariffs exceed what Section 301 actually authorizes, since that statute has historically been used to address narrow practices by a single country or industry rather than broad economic measures. While that specific litigation targets a different legal authority than the Section 338 action against Canada, trade lawyers widely expect similar challenges to be filed against the Canada-specific proclamations once they take effect, precisely because Section 338 has never been tested at this scale, and its boundaries remain, as of today, entirely undefined by any court. For everyday consumers on both sides of the border, the practical stakes are more immediate. Trade compliance firm GHY International is advising importers to review right now whether their Canadian-sourced goods fall under any of the 3 annexes attached to the proclamations, because a valid certificate of origin will not save them starting August the 19th. Companies are being told to rerun their landed cost calculations on anything scheduled to ship on or after August the 19th, since goods that clear customs before the effective date are not subject to the new duty at all, while functionally identical goods clearing a day later would carry the full 50% add-on. That kind of cliff-edge timing tends to produce exactly what you'd expect in the days before a deadline like this. A scramble to accelerate shipments, warehouses filling up on both sides of the border, and freight brokers fielding a wave of last-minute questions from importers who assumed wrongly that their paperwork already protected them. There's a broader economic angle worth considering too, because tariffs on this scale rarely stay contained to the specific goods named in a proclamation. If Canada does eventually respond with its own retaliatory measures once the deadline passes, American exporters to Canada would face a separate and distinct set of costs on their side of the border, a possibility multiple trade analysts have flagged as a real risk sitting just behind the current back and forth over autos, alcohol, and dairy. Freight industry analysts tracking cross-border shipping volumes this week describe Canadian vehicles as sitting at the center of the broader negotiation, currently facing a 25% tariff under a separate action entirely from the Section 338 proclamations, with Ottawa pushing hard to secure the same 15% rate that Japan and South Korea have already locked in through their own negotiations with Washington, alongside relief from existing Section 232 steel and aluminum duties. How that separate auto tariff negotiation resolves could end up mattering just as much to the Canadian economy as whatever happens with the 50% Section 338 duties on August the 19th. There's one more dimension to this story that's easy to lose inside the trade statistics. The ordinary businesses caught in the middle on both sides of the border who did not choose this fight and cannot easily hedge against it. A Canadian auto parts supplier that spent years qualifying its products under USMCA rules of origin now has to explain to its American customers why that qualification no longer guarantees duty-free treatment. A cross-border freight broker has to rebuild landed cost estimates for clients overnight, because a shipment that would have cleared the border tariff-free 2 weeks ago might carry a 50% surcharge if it clears after August the 19th instead. Weekly freight industry reporting this week describes exactly this dynamic playing out in real time. With the August 19th deadline flagged as the single date every cross-border shipper in North America is currently watching most closely, ahead of ordinary seasonal freight considerations that would normally dominate mid-August logistics planning. And it isn't only the tariffs themselves creating uncertainty, it's the sheer unfamiliarity of the legal tool being used. Multiple trade law firms have independently noted, in advisories written weeks apart from each other, that Section 338 has effectively sat dormant since the 1930s, meaning there is no real body of precedent, no established pattern of implementing guidance from Customs and Border Protection, and no real-world example anyone can point to for how enforcement will actually unfold once the effective date arrives. That is an unusual amount of operational uncertainty to be sitting on top of, less than a week out from a tariff action of this size actually taking effect. Zoom out, and there's a reason this particular dispute keeps returning to Ottawa in the reporting, even though the tariffs themselves are American policy imposed unilaterally from Washington. Ottawa is where the counter-pressure originates. The provincial liquor bans, the auto import quotas Washington objects to, the dairy supply management system that predates this entire trade war by decades. Ottawa is where Carney's cabinet has to weigh a 50% hit to $20 billion of exports against the political cost of caving to what many Canadians view as unjustified pressure from a much larger neighbor. And Ottawa is where, this week, the country's top trade officials were being briefed on options, just as their negotiators sat across the table from the U.S. Trade Representative in Washington. Whatever combination of concession and retaliation emerges from this moment will be decided, ultimately, in those two capitals, even as the economic consequences ripple out to businesses and consumers who have no seat at either table. Before we close, it is worth being honest about what remains genuinely unresolved. As of this recording, no final trade deal between Washington and Ottawa has been announced. The tariffs remain scheduled to take effect on August the 19th, unless the two governments reach an agreement, or unless the Trump administration chooses to modify or suspend the proclamations, an option Section 338 itself allows the president to exercise. Canada has not announced what, if any, retaliatory measures it would deploy if the tariffs proceed, and Prime Minister Carney has deliberately kept that card close, saying signaling it in advance would be counterproductive to ongoing talks. It is also worth flagging that some of the White House's underlying trade statistics, like the exact causes behind the drop in American auto exports to Canada, are contested by Canadian officials, who maintain their measures were a defensive response to earlier American tariffs rather than unprovoked discrimination. And whether legal challenges against this unprecedented use of Section 338 will succeed in the Court of International Trade is, as of now, entirely untested and unknown. The sources behind this reporting include the White House's own fact sheet on the proclamations, reporting and analysis from NPR, CNN Business, and CNBC on the initial announcement, CBC News and BNN Bloomberg's on-the-ground coverage from Ottawa and Washington through this week, Bloomberg's reporting on U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer's public remarks, and trade law advisories from firms including Wiley, White and Case, Steptoe, Butts Along, Holland, and Knight, and GHY International, each of which has published detailed technical breakdowns of the proclamation text itself. So here is where it stands. In 4 days, a 50% tariff lands on $20 billion of Canadian goods, unless Ottawa and Washington close a deal first. And even if they do, the fact that USMCA no longer offers automatic protection has already changed how businesses on both sides of the border think about cross-border trade going forward. Whether you see this as overdue leverage against genuine trade imbalances, or as an unpredictable escalation that undermines the very trade agreement Washington itself signed a few years ago, is exactly the kind of question worth sitting with. What do you think happens on August the 19th? A deal, a delay, or the full 50% landing as scheduled? Let us know where you stand. Thanks for watching, and we'll keep tracking this one as it develops.